We now return to Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the radio show discussing the honest truth about Illinois policy and politics. Here's AM 560's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back with Pat Hughes, co-founder of the Illinois Opportunity Project, on this edition of Illinois Rising. And Pat, Chicago Public Schools making headlines this week, as they're wont to do, not for good reasons, as is almost always the case. Turns out Chicago Public Teachers Pension Fund, which is only about 50% funded, overpaid retirees by nearly $2.8 million in recent years because of a misrepresentation of state law. About a quarter of the money has been returned, but there's still three-quarters that hasn't been. But, I mean, $2.8 million, this is just a rounding error between friends. I mean, what's the big deal?
You know, Dan, as you know, and as some of our listeners know, I attended a Chicago public school when I was a kid, starting in 1975, and it's August, which means that every August there is discussion about the failure that is CPS. This is going back from when I was 6 years old, and the looming possibility of a strike, right? It's never just, well, we need to pay this money back to the pension that was overpaid, or our bond rating is in the toilet, or whatever. It's always, and there's a looming strike. And that's part of the process going on here again this year, and it happens just about every year.
Well, I mean, there is some good news. I mean, in terms of improving the quality of education, Chicago Board of Education is proposing to sell nearly $1 billion in bonds for construction projects and other expenses. So there'll maybe be some new buildings. I mean, I guess it'll be the same thing going on inside those buildings. There's not so much focus on what is happening inside the buildings in terms of the quality of education in a city public school system with somewhere between 350, 400,000 kids. I'd love to see that number audited, by the way.
Is Karen Lewis
what the actual population is?
Is Karen Lewis going to demand that the CTU build those buildings, that they actually put on construction hats and get paid for the construction? She might. That might be the next step.
I don't think they're interested in such heavy lifting, not to mention year-round work. But here's the thing about CPS. You've got three-quarters of the children in CPS who neither do reading or math at grade level in 4th and 8th grades. So we spend north of $15,000 per pupil. As you mentioned, it's junk rated, annual $1 billion budget deficits, annual budget crunches, annual threats of strike and actual strikes not so long ago. And we just keep rinsing and repeating with the civilian leadership of the city, just kind of dismissing the possibility of a strike and always saying, we're working on it.
And
it's a work in progress.
New bricks and mortar, Dan, are not going to solve any of those problems. This is a structural problem based on who's in the system, who is in charge of the union, who is teaching the kids, and what their incentives are in terms of teaching the kids. And building $1 billion worth of buildings isn't going to change any of that.
All right. Well, for more on the financial side, let's bring on our friend Brian Battle. Brian Battle is the director at Performance Trust Companies. You've been studying CPS finances for a while. That's got to be very taxing work, so to speak. And you find what we all find, it seems, right? The district's functionally insolvent and just continues to borrow against tomorrow to pay for yesterday and hopes that somehow things are going to turn around.
Yeah, I think that's right, Dan. Is the probably the most agonizing thing about CPS is certainly their current financial condition, in that they're running, about a $5.5 billion revenue stream that they have to allocate, and they have about $1 billion deficit. So that it's the thing that's probably most concerning is, one, that how did we end up here? Second of all, it seems that the current opinion of CPS is it's some unforeseen calamity, and this has sort of happened to CPS somehow. And probably the worst part is that this is all band-aiding over short-term problems, and there doesn't seem to be any recognition or any way to address the long term.
And that's despite $750 million property tax increase plural, just in the last 12 months by Tiny Dancer and the city council. Now that, of course, is not CPS. CPS is doing their own tax increases, but it's all part and parcel of the same problem of propping up this house of cards called Chicago and Chicago Public Schools.
Yeah, and so the property tax is about $250 million. It was approved by the state, and so that's an extra levy on the taxpayers of the city of Chicago. Also, CPS is planning on the state giving them $215 million, which helps plug the deficit. And they're also planning on Chicago Teachers Union cooperating and forgoing the pension payment. So in the city, 9% of a teacher's pay goes to the pension plan, and by tradition, Chicago Public Schools have been paying 7 of that 9%. So Forrest Claypool and CPS has asked Chicago Teachers Union, or has indicated, we're not going to pick up that 7% anymore, and what they've gotten in return is a threat of a strike. So I don't know if that's theater, where CTU is just sort of acting out that they have to protect their members, but it is not a foregone conclusion that two of those things will happen. That A, the state's going to send the $215 million, and B, that CTU is going to cooperate, or Chicago Teachers Union is going to cooperate and start funding have the members start funding their own pension payments.
Hey, Brian, it's Pat Hughes. Thanks for being here. I don't think that the threat over the 7% circumstance on the pension is an idle threat. I think they will potentially strike over that. Is there a policy or a set of policies that are being talked about that can be put forth that can give the parents of Chicago public school children, like my parents were for several years, hope that this financial circumstance can be abated and then turned around? Or is the structural circumstance with the unions, with the cities, what you just talked about with Mayor Emanuel, Karen Lewis, Forrest Claypool, those relationships make it impossible to reform or restructure how this thing is financed?
So there's two problems. The first is that this has taken years, and it's taken decades to get to this point in the cycle. And what we're talking about is a cycle of insolvency. I mean, and insolvency isn't like, gee, they're running out of money, and gosh, we had to do something in the future. This is a function of there's no money left in the checkbook. They made us over $600 million pension payment to the teachers' pension plan this summer, and that left them with, I believe, $28 million in the bank, which covers about a day and a half worth of expenses in CPS. So it's taken a long time to get here. So Rahm Emanuel just showed up. Forrest Claypool just took the job. Certainly CTU has been consistent over the past couple of decades. So you can't lay it all at the feet of the mayor and the superintendent. However, their job is to remediate the problem and then make a long-term solution. So I think the parents and the taxpayers in the city limits have to understand it's a long-term problem. You cannot just wave a wand and say we're going to raise taxes and fix the problem. As Dan alluded to, there's a property tax coming for CPS, and there was one coming for the city, but that $250 million isn't close to being enough. It just isn't. That's not a number that solves the problem.
So that's it. It's a long-term problem, but it's a short-term problem too. And it seems to me, $250 million, $750 million. The teachers' pension fund alone is underfunded by about $9 billion, not million, of course. So I mean, is there any way? Governor Rauner was criticized for suggesting that bankruptcy may be a viable option for CPS to reorganize and get out from underneath some of these obligations and kind of recast their financial future, as companies do, as cities like Detroit did. Is there any realistic way to get out from underneath this financial picture that the city has created for itself and CPS has created for itself, short of bankruptcy? I mean, is there any way?
So that's two questions. What CPS could do right now is change the way that they run the school system. It could be more efficient, and it's probably going to take higher taxes, expense cutting, and a reformation of the retirement system. Like starting tomorrow, if you're a new teacher in the city of Chicago, you're in a 401k. First thing you do is when you have a hole, is stop digging the hole. So yeah, there are things they could do right now, but the political momentum and I think just the history and tradition of the city would indicate that that's not possible. It's or probable, or it's impractical. They'll never be able to do it. So I think the real answer is that there has to be the ability for Chicago Public Schools to declare bankruptcy. So let's be real careful. Bankruptcy in the municipal arena is very different than it is a corporation and for an individual, because you can't just liquidate the school system or sell the parts off or do a rehabilitation. So Chapter 9 was specifically invented in the 30s for municipalities. So you remember during during the Depression, a lot of municipalities just ceased to exist or ran out of money, and they had a horrible problem. So the first thing is Chapter 9 is reserved first just for municipalities. Secondarily, it is voluntary. Third thing is it is a petition and federal bankruptcy court. That's very important. That it's a federal filing. And then, so what the most important thing about a Chapter 9 bankruptcy is, one, all unsecured creditors get their contracts ripped up. So so effectively what we're saying is the Chicago public school pension plan and the promises that were made are null and void, and you have to start over. So that is imperative in Illinois for a couple of reasons. One is right now there's no way for a municipality to declare Chapter 9 in Illinois. You have to be specifically authorized. So the General Assembly would have to pass a law that authorizes Chapter 9, which they're eligible to do. They can do that. The second thing is that federal filing is a federal filing. So the Illinois State Supreme Court says pension payments are sacrosanct. The pensions can be neither, in the exact term, as diminished nor impaired. And so what we're talking about is the Illinois State Constitution. In Chapter 9, which is a federal filing, federal law supersedes or is superior to state law. So if there is a Chapter 9 filing, it's too bad what the Illinois State Supreme Court says. You get to start over. So I think for the real live practical thing to do is, instead of trying to make 1,000 different changes at the school system level, which is going to be very difficult and politically, I would imagine, impossible, I think we need a state-level authorization for Chapter 9, and then this is exactly what it's invented for. Chapter 9 allows the school system to have some forbearance on its creditors, lets them start over, and it lets them do what they're supposed to, which is take the money that they receive and educate kids and have appropriate facilities and have textbooks and try and give kids a chance to get ahead and not divert a bunch of money to a pension plan that's insolvent.
All right, Brian Battle, after that answer, I am nominating you to be to CPS what Kevin Orr was to Detroit. Brian Battle, he's the Director of Performance Trust Companies. Brian, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Of course, Dan, it's my pleasure.